Hey everybody, welcome back to a new video on this channel, and today we have a look into BFF. Best friends forever? Yes, of course, but let's see what BFF means in the context of web development and how to use that pattern right after the intro. Let's go. In last week's video, we talked a lot about using Nuxt with different backends, which more or less meant using different backends like Hono, Express, and Fastify in the Node.js or like JavaScript environment, and then use H3's compatibility layer to use them inside Nuxt.js. And lots of people said like, hey, yeah, that's great, but I don't have like a JavaScript backend. I don't have something I can integrate into Nuxt. So instead, I use something like Django or Laravel or Spring Boot, or maybe some bunch of third-party APIs as well, which is totally valid. I mean, you don't have to write everything in JavaScript anyway, right? If you have something that needs hyper performance and some machine learning, then maybe another language might be a really good idea, or your backend team, your dedicated backend team is just more proficient in that. So no problem with that, but let's see what the BFF part means and how we can still improve the usage of external like backend services or third-party APIs in Nuxt and with Nitro. So once again, BFF, yes, best friends forever like Nuxt and you are, of course, obviously, but in this video, it's more about the backend for front-end architectural pattern. And now you might wonder, wait, Alex. Backend for front-end? Like we have a backend and we have a front-end. So why do we need anything in between? Let's have a look. Commonly, you have exactly that setup, a front end and a general backend that serves all the data for the front end. But what if, for example, multiple applications querying that backend, and of course your backend team doesn't want to build routes for every single of these applications to cater their needs. So let's say we have a front end, and that front end only needs a user's ID, username, birth date, and email, but of course the backend gives all the things like tons of other unnecessary data, which kind of makes sense because in other calls you might need them. So now you could start and say, okay, yeah, we have routes, we have filters, we have things to improve. But on the one hand, this increases the strain on your backend team. Plus, it's always a question whether the backend should really focus on what data needs to be served than supplying a general way of fetching data and their needs. And this is where the backend for frontend comes in, right? So we really need something here in the middle, especially if we don't only have a backend, but maybe also data from other services like headless CMS, third-party APIs, and maybe we can't even control the backend at all and say, hey, this is the data that we get. That's it. We have to do the manipulation and transformation on our own. So let's see how it works with a backend for frontend and then how to implement it with Nuxt and Nitro. And if we move from this schematic all the way over to the backend for frontend one, you'll see, okay, there's not that much happening, except that the frontend is now calling the BFF. The BFF is calling the backend is returning data to BFF, and the backend for frontend is returning the data to the frontend. And in here, the data transformation will happen. So we strip all the unnecessary content. Now you might say, yeah, come on, for these few fields, sure, I get you. But I've seen projects where you have really like kilobytes, probably sometimes even megabytes of data that you don't really want to send at all, because for some requests, you might just need a list of names, for example, to preview some articles or to have a simple list overview page. And this is where the BFF is really shining. So if your general backend doesn't allow that to do, or maybe you want to do some things on top of it, like caching, for example, right? Or say, oh yeah, I have to enrich the data with data from other APIs. Then we really need that kind of backend for frontend, because you also don't necessarily want to integrate all the third-party APIs in your general backend. Because if you want to switch out a service, well, then you have to do it for all the applications, and it will also increase the strain on your backend. While if you say, oh yeah, in this case, we want to use another, let's say, image provider, then why not switching that out in the BFF that is bound to your application and not the backend? So yeah, this is definitely something we can do. And the best part is we can just imagine the backend, in our case, as not under our control. That makes things a bit easier. Just saying like, hey, dear backend engineers, can we implement that? And then we have some big back and forth. Sometimes it's also totally useful, don't get me wrong. But if we have all the data in a way or another, then we can also fetch them. So let's see what we can do in Nuxt and Nitro to more or less make the whole thing happen. I will also refer to some of the videos, for example, about caching in Nitro and so on, so on. So if you haven't seen these, definitely take a look in some more in-depth content. But let's get started. All right, folks, our demo application is as minimal as usual, as you know already. So we have the compatibility date set. I also made a video if you don't know about that, but don't worry, it won't do much for now. We have that little background color, so it will be dark in the background and white text. And then we have our future compatibility version 4 to opt into the Nuxt 4 breaking changes. Whenever they will be released as Nuxt 4, you're already prepared. Also made a video about that, link in the description. And then we have an app.view, so we use that new app folder, the structure from Nuxt 4. And then in our app.view, we just say, we have a user, we fetch it from the very simple JSON placeholder typico.com API, and then we show the content. And if we go to the browser, then this will look like this. Okay, nothing crazy so far, right? We fetch some data and we're good. But what if we want to do more? Like we said in the example, maybe we just want to strip everything except these fields, ID, name, username, email. So we want to get rid of the rest, because just imagine having a big user object, not only with these data, but maybe with like attached comments and that, and this will all be fetched by the backend. Of course, that's not really what we want, so maybe let's remove them. And of course, now we could start saying, yeah, but you can just do that in the front end. You can just say, take the user object, delete the fields, or like destructure it or whatever, and you're good. But the problem there is that then the data will still be transmitted through wire, which means slower page speed, right? Like we need to get lots of data that we don't even need. And especially the bigger the data, the harder the thing is. I've already shown how to solve the problem with use fetch and use async data with the transform function, which we can just showcase here real quick and then see why this is a solution only halfway through and we might still need a BFF. So as mentioned, we can use the transform function here and say, okay, we have some input. We don't know what it is. And then we just say like, okay, you know what? ID is input.id. You can just type it as any here for now. And then we had the name is input name. The same thing with the username is also input the username. And last but not least, we wanted the email, which is input.email. And if we now eventually switch back to the browser, we'll see, okay, this is gone. That's great. Perfect. The issue is like, sure, if we take a look at the page source, it's also only in there, right? That works fine. But if we now say, okay, we would navigate on the client side from A to B, like the first request, of course, happens on the server side, so not too much data is sent. But if we then do a client side request, then we have the data again, because the original API will be queried. And no matter how you transform your data, it's still too much, because you can't just say, hey, API, give me less. It's not under our control in this example. So instead, we want to move the whole transformation over to our backend for frontend, which we'll build right now with Nitro and H3 in our Nuxt application. Also, this of course can be a standalone service. You don't have to bake it into Nuxt. And also, if you use something else, if you use plain view, feel free to just spin up a Nitro server and do the same. But with Nuxt, it's a little bit easier due to, well, end-to-end type safety, for example. So let's get started. First, of course, we want to create a server folder, and in here we have a new API, and let's say we call it users, similar to our example here, and then we have an ID, and it's a TypeScript file, of course. So then we create an event handler, and more or less we can copy the code from here because we still have to fetch the original API, right? So what we want to do is we always want to fetch that API, but of course, we can't use transform here. That's only for use fetch and use async data. So we have const result is await the whole call. And now we can just say like, okay, we return more or less what we did before here. And instead of input, well, we just say result. And now, of course, also, yes, this is unknown by default. So we can just type it as any. Or you know what, let's just do a record string any, and that will solve most of the issues around that. That's also fine. And now we know, okay, things are in there. We can have way nicer types, but that's for later, of course. So one more thing I want to do is we want to get the ID. So we say, okay, we want to use get router param here. We say pass in the event and get the ID. If there is no ID or if it's 0, then we just throw a new error created by create error, just saying, all right, no ID supplied, provided, might be easier. And then we of course have the status code, which is 400. That's fine. Okay, now we want to insert that ID here. And let's see if we now call the whole thing, if we now call the whole API, what it will return. For that, we move back in the browser and we just use API users1. And here we see that's exactly what we need, right? That's exactly the data that was also shown here in our page. Now, the only thing is left to do is we actually have to call that API in our very own application. So to do this, we go into our app here and then we say, okay, instead of the whole code here, we can just say use fetch API users ID. And the best part is just say 1 here, for example. This already gives us the wonderful type safety. Even though we don't have many types here, it will eventually still help us when we have them in place. So that seems pretty good. Let's see if it works. Let's go back to the browser and go to our application, refresh it, and it still works as it should. Lovely. Okay, so far so good. Now, this doesn't seem like a huge improvement, but the best part is now we can do a lot of things with that data. So first of all, we can cache it, which we'll do next. And then why not show all the users that have been accessed, like the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5 users throughout the whole page. So if someone clicks on a user, well, then that user will be saved in some kind of storage, and all the other people on the index page, they will see, oh yeah, these are the users that were recently shown. This is kind of an inspirational feature from a project I've worked on already, which basically looks like this. So here we also have like recently searched people, and if I search for more people, they will just be added here. And I think that's pretty helpful. The best part is also here, I use the backend for front end, mainly because the data was not really under our control. So yeah, let's go ahead with the caching and then with the recent users. And last but not least, we can also show a few more tricks here and there. So let's get started. The caching part is quite interesting. I've also made a video about that caching in Nitro. And once again, you could think, oh yeah, we just use the find cached event handler here. But I would suggest not to, mainly because we also want to implement the recent users functionality soon. So we rather don't want to cache the whole API endpoint because we still want to register whether or not a user was requested. Instead, we could just say, okay, let's create a function that is caching the whole API call and the transformation. So basically this part here should be cached. And we can do that, of course, in the same file, but let's just say we have server utils users.ts, and then in here we could say export const get user. Then this is a defined cached function, and eventually we have the ID here, which can be a string, and eventually we want to do all the things in here. So let's just quickly get this whole code over here, paste it in, and this is already looking pretty okay. If we need an async to make sure the await works, we have this part in place. Great. One more thing to suggest, it's always nice to also provide the H3 event, especially if you deploy at some point at the edge, because let's quickly import that here, H3 event from H3. Because if you, for example, use Cloud for Workers, I think that's even a better example, then you really want to make sure that these are waiting for all the calls that might happen and don't have any dangling promises. So with the find cached function, you can make sure that's the case. And even though we don't need the event here at all, we can just provide it and it will still be considered, and then event.wait until will be called. But that's just as a tiny hint. So we have the get user function now, and instead of calling what we had here before, we can just use get user. Instead of the code that we had back here, we can just write get user and then pass in the ID that we have here. We await it and say const user is get user. Wonderful. We also need the event, of course. That's what we passed in before. And from here, we can even say, okay, later on to do, make sure the user is added as recent. And then we're fine. And of course, we want to return the user still, otherwise things might break. Okay. So Last but not least, we want to set up our cached function because we have it here, but now we can say, let's disable SWR and have a max age of, I don't know, 10, or just say like straight away. Yeah, let's do a max age of, it doesn't matter much because the data is stale anyway. Like it's not changing. So we can do that. We can even leave SWR on for that example. And if you don't know what all of these is, definitely check out the caching in Nitro video, where I explained all these in depth. So if we just open the dev tools and refresh the page, then we'll see, wow, 8 milliseconds response time. That's pretty decent. That's rather clear that there's a cache behind because in 8 milliseconds you can't do any API call. So we simply decided to cache the data from our backend without them being involved at all. It's all cached and also not only for the application. If you are in another application querying the same backend, well, you can define your own cache times, or even if you have a different route and so on and so on. So you're fully autonomous in your decision what to cache and for how long. Now, last but not least, let's implement the recent users thing. And then we're good to go with a very simple example of backend for frontend. And for the recent users, we still start once again in our users.ts for the utils. And we have an export const here saying, or maybe let's just make a function straight away, get recent users. So somehow we want to get them, right? It is probably async, so we need this for sure. And then we also have an export async function that adds a recent user. And then we need the user data here. So we say user. We don't have a type for that yet. It's maybe time to finally type things. So say type user is ID string, name string, username string, and email string. What a surprise. Here, because we don't have any types here, we can just say as user, and then we're fine. And in here, we want to return a promise with the users. And eventually here, we can decide to either ignore that and just say, okay, this is void, right? This is also fine. Or we say, you know what, we want to get the new users as well after adding them. So we can even say here, okay, promise user. That's really up to the implementation detail. But of course, nothing is in here so far, so let's improve that. Okay, so first of all, we want to get all the users. So let's say const users, or let's say const current users equals get users, of course. Maybe get recent users is a bit better. We want to await the whole thing as it is async, and then we have the users in theory. We also want to set a user, let's say recent user limit, and we can set it to 3. So now what we can do is we want to actually add the user to the array, and eventually, if the whole array is too long, well, then we just decide to remove the last one. So what we can do is we can say current users dot push. We can also unshift it. It doesn't matter if it's the front or the end. It doesn't matter much. Let's just do unshift for you. That's fine. We add the user in here. And now we say if current users dot length, if it's greater than the recent user limit, well, then of course we want to make sure to say current users dot pop, remove the last one that was added to the list, and we're good. And now we have to save the users again. So this will be a little to do for us. And same idea, we can just then say return current users, and then we fulfilled the contract we set up with the types. So how do we save the users and how do we get the things? Well, this we'll figure out now. First, we need a key for wherever this is stored. So we just say resend users. That's fine. And now we use Nitro's integration with unstorage. So we use unstorage under the hood and the use storage function in Nitro. Also made a video about that, link in the description as usual. So we'll briefly go through that. More details are in the mentioned video. And the first thing we want to do is, of course, we want to say const users equals use storage. Then we can define name here if we want to, but we can just leave the default for now. Get items, or in this case, just get item. We use the key. We just want this one item, which is an array saved in there. And in here, we want to await it as well. And then just say return users. So now we also want to make sure it is of the right type. So we don't want to type it key, but we want to type it user array, and then we're good to go. The only thing is it could be null. That's true. So worst case, we just do this. And we're fine. So in case this can't be retrieved for whatever reason, we just make sure it will be an empty array. And now we can get the whole thing. Perfect. So last but not least, we want to save the users. So to save the users, we just say await. We also use storage once again, and we want to say set item in the same scenario with the same key, and the values will be current users. So also here, we don't even need to type it because of course it will be inferred by the current users that are provided here. So then we save the users. Let's even keep the comment. I think that's pretty nice. And then we're good. Now, the only thing is we need to implement it somehow, right? We need to call these things somewhere. So what we can now do is in our id.ts here, we know what kind of user will be fetched. So there where we have the to do, we can just say, okay, you know what, add user or add recent user. And then we just call this with user, we await it, and we're good to go. So this will make sure that all users that are fetched will be saved as recent users until there are 3 in there, then the first one will be removed. And last but not least, we actually want to make sure this is also possible to show in our application. So we need an API endpoint to show it, and we need to be able to fetch different users. So let's go. Let's start with the API endpoint. So instead of API users id.ts, we can just say API users info recent, for example. And in here, there's also a Nitro event handler, and we just return get recent users. And that's all we need to do, luckily, because we nicely extracted it already. So what we can do as a test already is we can go back to the browser in here, we can refresh that page, and now we can say users info recent and see if it's in there or not. And the answer is it is in there. So if we refresh this page a couple times and then go back, we see on recent, user 1, 2, and 3, all the same. Okay, if we now would say, let's just take users 2 and users 5 in here, and now we go back to info recent, well, then they're in here as well. Perfect. So our assignment is kind of done. Now we just have to do the front end part to make sure it's changeable, and then we're good to go. So let's get going. To implement it, I would just say we do a very, very simple variation of the whole thing. We just say we have a constant number here. It's a ref, right? We just start with a 0 here. Then we have this wonderful useFetch function where we say, okay, this will be a getter function then. Could also be computed, that's also fine. And in here we want to use number, the value. We can move it into a template string to make it look a bit nicer. That's never hurts. And now we want to change that number based on, well, whenever something changes. So we could just say, let's have some buttons here. Button v4 n in 5, and then say fetch user n. And at click, we just say number equals n. And now you might wonder if this actually works, because it looks like black magic a little bit, but yes, it does. And also this was covered in our use async data versus use fetch video. So let's have a look in the browser and see if this is doing what it should. And I admit that buttons are not nice. I'm not a UI designer, right? And it's not the point of the video. So if we click it, it will just magically work because use fetch is watching the ref and we're good. And last but not least, what we also want to do is refetch the data now whenever we change something to see the recent users. So back to the code, how do we do that? Well, we can just say we have another const data recent users here. And we say await use fetch. And then we just say /API users info recent. And in here, we could just trigger the watch. And we watch a user. So whenever user changes, recent users will also be refetched. And now what we could do, we could do a UL, an LI v4, and maybe an H2 v4 recent users, user in users. Users and recent users, and then we just say user.name here and maybe user.id, and then we're good. So let's see if this works and try it out in the browser. And here we are clicking around and seeing things will change, and 2 is in, 4, 3, 1 is out, 5, 5. Okay, multiple clicking on 5 doesn't work because it doesn't refresh the data. That's also fine. We could even have a trigger if we want to, but that's okay because data's already there. Why should we? And these could also be radio buttons instead of just buttons. Of course, semantic HTML would be better, but I think for the demo, that's sufficient. And here we are. We implemented a little backend for frontend with some own functionality without bothering any backend dev. It's fast due to the caching. It's all super close. We have the type safety and we're good to go. I think this is a very nice capability of what Nuxt together with H3, Unstorage, Nitro, and all the tools around can do within, just a couple minutes. Any questions? Let me know in the comments, please. I'll always check them out and answer. I'm back from vacation now, so the videos you've seen were recorded a little bit ahead. Maybe seen in the 10, I'm just kidding. Anyway, let me know if there's any questions. And next week, next Friday, next video, you got it. Talk to you soon, folks, and happy hacking.